Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. We have a very special guest with us today who calls herself the grief guru and is doing some tremendous work out there in the world of grief and loss due to her own significant losses that we'll get into in a moment. But I'd like to introduce Kelli Nielsen to you. She is a speaker, she is an author, and she is a grief and loss coach. And so I want to welcome you, Kelli, to the show today. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure. And I just am always happy when we have these platforms for conversation because grief is one of those taboo things. And so I just have such a heart for folks like you that create the space to have these conversations. So thanks for having me.
I feel the same way with people like you that are out there doing the work. So let's go ahead and jump right in. I didn't want to give too much away in your introduction because I think that you have a painful story. And I also think that you have a remarkable story given what you've done with your two very significant losses. So please start wherever you would like.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I always share with people I'm the grief guru, but nobody grows up wanting to be the grief guru. It wasn't an aspiration as a child. It wasn't what my plan or thought for my life. But my first real significant encounter with grief occurred about 5 years ago when my mom committed suicide on February 1st of 2017. And the circumstances around her passing and the questions and just trauma involved really shattered our family. And honestly, our family hasn't recovered to this day. And for me personally, I was devastated. My mom was my best friend, and I spoke to her every day. We were so close. And to say it blindsided me is an understatement. It shook me to my core. It was a crisis of faith for me. I just was questioning everything. And I was looking for help. I looked for help. I looked for help from my local church. I looked for help in community groups and things like that. And I wasn't finding help. So much so, I was in a leadership position and I had to step down and find an alternate position because I was not in a place to lead anyone. I could hardly lead myself out of bed every morning. I like to refer to that time as kind of a zombie-like existence. I just was going through the motions and getting up every day, barely, and putting one foot in front of the other. That was devastating to me. And I ended up going to a support group. Finally, somebody referred a suicide support group. And so I went and I was so comforted by the fact that everybody in the room got it, right? Like they all understood the pain that I was in. But I was horrified by the fact that everybody in the room was in the same zombie-like condition that I was. And for many of them, it had been months or even years since they lost their loved one. Half the people in the group were unable to maintain employment because they were so debilitated by grief and loss. And so I just started to think, okay, this is just what my life is going to be. I'm just going to be sad and surviving and existing for the rest of my life. And I continued on in that fashion for several months before, thank God, I went to an event where I saw a speaker share her story of loss and trauma. This amazing woman named Immaculée, who had survived the Rwandan genocide. And she shared how she was hid away in a bathroom for 90 days with 8 other women and literally heard everyone she had known be massacred around her. She lost her entire family. And she shared on stage not only the horror of that event, but her healing process and journey. And I saw a woman who was totally healed. She was whole. She was looking forward to her future. She was happy. She was, and it changed my life. I saw an example of someone who had, recovered from something so horrendous. And in that moment, I said, oh my goodness, if she can do it, I can do it. If God will do it for her, he'll do it for me. And so I decided right then and there that I would recover. I didn't know where to start. I didn't know how long it would take. I didn't know what was involved, but I just found out that it was possible. In that moment, I discovered that it was possible. So I began to study, get into prayer and God's word, but I studied a lot about neurology and our neurological systems, what happens to our minds and body when we experience grief and trauma. And I started making subtle tweaks. I started changing things in my environment and little habits and behaviors. And I started to feel better. I started to feel back to myself and have more energy. And I started to recover truly. And thank goodness I did when I did, because it was about 6 months after that I got the news that my son died of a drug overdose. My 20-year-old son, Quintin, had been struggling with addiction for about 7 years. And we actually found out through social media, if you can believe it. A friend posted online that he had passed away. And so for about 2.5 hours, we frantically tried to determine if it was a rumor or if it was true. And it was eventually confirmed that he had passed away early the morning of July 8th, 2018, of a lethal combination of Xanax that had been laced with fentanyl. And the thing that'll probably stay with me, one of the things that will stay with me for the rest of my life, is my daughter was with me when we got the news. My 13-year-old daughter was with me when we got the news. And the first thing she said to me was, "You're not going anywhere, are you, Mom?" That was her first concern, because she had just lost her grandma to suicide, and she thought that this trauma would be too much for me to handle. And I'm so thankful that I was able to tell her confidently, "No, I'm not going anywhere." I knew I was going to be able to get through this. What I didn't know is how fast and efficient I was going to be able to move through grief and mourning by using the skills that I had learned when I lost my mom. And so that's where I really, started to embrace this call to teach others to do the same, that there really is a skill set involved. There really are things you can do and practice and implement to dramatically help your grieving and mourning process, to help you move through and find healing. And so that's what I have been doing ever since, honestly.
I mean, you lost them not even a year apart, if I'm doing the math
A
right.
year, a little over a year. It was
little over a
February
year.
of 2017 and then August of 2018. So a little over a year, yeah.
And those are two such profound losses. And what you said about being debilitated was exactly my experience when I lost my brother. And I write all about that as well, where I felt like I really felt the same way. This is going to be my life. And that it's always going to feel like my world is gray. It's gray every day, all day, right? That was I think that when I think about grief and loss, and I think about that feeling of being in darkness, you've got the grief of losing the person that you love. And then you've got this terror that it's never going to get any better. Those two pieces together is enough to make you not want to go on. And some people choose not to. And that is such a travesty, because as you said, when we do, I call it the grief work, when we really can do our grief work, which can look very different for different people, but you cannot shove grief work aside. If you do, it will rear its head in some way. It just will.
It will.
Can you talk about, let's go back to your mom.
Yeah.
So with your mother's loss first, because you did a lot of hard work almost in preparation to then lose your son, right? I mean,
yeah.
And interestingly, I lost my brother, then I lost my mother. And I know the work that I did around my brother, I know it prepared me for the loss of my mom, because that experience was nowhere near as dark. It's like, I know this, I've been here, and I've got resources now.
Right.
I've got some tools in the toolbox. So let's go back to your mom when you'd gone to a grief and loss group, and everybody was still pretty debilitated from their loss. And you decided to go off and study about the brain, right? What happens in the brain when we go through trauma. Tell us what you learned, and tell us some of those very specific tools that you learned to use after the loss of your mom.
Yeah, I think the biggest, most fundamental ones is just even having the belief that you can recover. That's so powerful. It's so important, your mindset about recovery and healing and in your life going forward. If you believe that you're always going to be sad and there's no hope for you, that's going to be your experience. So it really starts there. But then after that, some of the skills and competencies are being mindful of what you're thinking, even being aware of your thoughts, doing little check-ins with yourself to say, how am I feeling? It's one of the gifts that I've received from grief is I am so much more self-aware of my limits and my capacity. I'm so much more patient and graceful and flexible with myself because I've painfully come to know that I am human and I do have limits. And it's my job and only my job to protect myself and my limits and voice my limits and protect my limits. That's something that I didn't do very well before this, but it kind of becomes sink or swim. When you're grieving, you really have to learn that. You have to learn about yourself and learn to advocate for yourself and protect yourself and some of those boundaries. I just learned a lot about neurological loops and how our brains thrive on predictability and patterns. And so whatever pattern, you're always creating patterns, whether you're aware of it or not. Whatever you're thinking about, whatever you're talking about and reading and studying, you're creating patterns in your brain. And so that's why grief can be so debilitating, because the thought of the loss is constantly flooding our brain. And if we let that go on unchecked, we're creating trauma loops. And part of the magnificent thing about our brain is that it doesn't know the difference between what's happening in our imagination and what's happening in real life. So and this is part of the beef I have with traditional support groups, because if you go and rehash your story every week, or you're constantly hearing other people's story, you're actually fortifying the trauma loop in your brain, and you're having a conditioned response to trauma. And it's really hard to get to a place of healing if you have cortisol and adrenaline and all these other things that are keeping you in that trauma loop or that fight or flight kind of place. And so we have to slow our brains down. We have to become mindful of what we're thinking. We have to put stop measures in place so that we don't dwell, so we don't go down the rabbit hole and just meditate and ruminate on the loss or the negative, harmful thoughts. And we also have to intentionally learn to focus on positive thoughts and moving forward thoughts and healing helpful thoughts. It sounds simple when you say it, but it's not simple to do. It's just like weight loss. Like, very simply, weight loss is just spending more calories than you eat. It sounds simple. It's not simple to do.
Well, I was going to say, I think that is so much that there's lots of self-help books on just about everything that you can imagine in the world. And the concepts are simple. The application is the exercise, right?
Right.
The application is the hard work, and the hard work is worth it.
Right.
And so anyways, keep going. I just wanted to reinforce what you just said, that it's not about being easy. It's a practice, it's a muscle. And most of us don't, because we loop constantly in our mind.
Right.
Like I told you that I developed a course on writing through grief and loss, and based on positive psychology. And it's the same thing. There's so much research out there about writing about your trauma.
Right.
If you write about your trauma, it's funny. I write about that. It's a loop. It's exactly what happens. But when you think about it from a different perspective, that's actually, what you water grows. I mean, really, if I want to put it really
100%.
simply, what you water grows. Where you put your focus expands. So please continue.
Yeah, no, 100%. So that's what we help people to do. And just what I learned is that, the neuroplasticity of our mind, that our mind is always changing, it's always evolving. And so that should be encouraging news for folks who are struggling in grief, is you're always changing the landscape of your brain. And so it may hurt today, but it can be different tomorrow. What you do today is going to determine how it feels tomorrow. But the other trick that I really want people to hear, that I had to learn, is that it doesn't just happen instantly. It's about consistency and repetition. So it takes 21 days to either remove a thought or implant a new thought, and it takes 63 days for that thing to become automatic. But that's the science behind it. So if you start a new habit, or you have a new way that you're thinking about the loss, if you do that for 63 days, it will become second nature. It'll move from your short-term memory to your long-term memory, and it'll become part of your automatic processing. So that's the thing. I see people try things, and we do this in all areas of life, right? Like, we go to the gym 3 times and we haven't lost 20 pounds. And so we think it doesn't work. We save money for 2 days and we're not a millionaire. So we go, blow our money at the mall. It's the same thing with this. It's not huge radical things you have to do. You just have to make small tweaks consistently over a period of time before you really start to reap the benefits. But once you've got that momentum and you've tipped that scale, then it really is exponential, the energy that you can get and the breakthrough that you can get and the healing that you can get. But it takes knowing the right things to do, and then having the accountability and support to do the right things consistently long enough to see the difference and the impact.
So tell us very practically, what does it look like now then when you think about the loss of your mother or the loss of your son? Because you're not saying, oh, I just don't think about them anymore. I know that's not what you're saying. Mm-hmm. So what happens when you do start to think about your mom and your son? What happens?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I will say 90% of the time when I think about my mom or my son, it brings a smile to my face. They're happy thoughts and happy memories and gratitude for the time that I had with them and gratitude for the things that I am doing now in their honor and for their legacy. Like the majority of thoughts center around that. But I do have times, obviously, where I wish my mom was here. Quintin would have been 24 now, and his friends are starting to get married and have kids, and all those milestones are slightly bittersweet. I'm so happy for seeing I love seeing his friends do life and do all those things, but I would be lying if I didn't say, it pokes a little like Quintin didn't get to do that. I didn't get to see, he didn't have kids, he didn't get married, those kinds of things. But I will say that it's such a small piece of the overall experience. And this is part of what I help people to do. I do things every day and on big and small occasions to include them and honor them and remember them. And I'm wearing, these are Quintin's little Nike slide slipper shoes. I wear them every day. And it's one of my little ways to include him in my life and have him with me. And I've heard of people do just really amazing creative things. I think people can think the only way you can stay connected to your loved one emotionally is if you're sad because they're gone. And that's just not true. You can stay connected to them emotionally through remembering them. And, Quentin and I used to have inside jokes and stuff. And when I see something that reminds me of one of our inside jokes, I'll literally say, like, yeah, I saw that, Quentin. And I'll have a laugh like to myself, even though he's not here physically. Those things don't go away. And I still participate in them completely, as if he was here.
That's so, I do too. And it's funny because my listeners know that I am deep, deep beliefs in the afterlife. And the irony that I studied that prior to my brother's death for decades. I talk to my brother and my mother every single day. Every single day. They're with me in pictures and things like that, but I can feel them. Like my brother was a prankster. He loved to joke. And so something will happen at work, or I feel like I can hear him laughing. And so I love that. And that you're wearing his little sliders. I think that we don't move on from loss. We move forward with them in our life, whatever that looks like for people. And I want to pivot just a little bit because I know you have a daughter. And your daughter was 13 at the time your son died, right? So you know that my area is sibling grief and loss, and that is the book that I wrote. So I'm curious, how did you help your daughter through the grieving process? Did you teach her these skills as well? Is she your only other child, your daughter?
Yeah.
I'd love to hear what that looks like or sounded like.
Yeah, that is a good one. And, so if anybody's had a teenage daughter, that comes with challenges in and of itself. And she was 13 when Quintin died. And I will say the first 2 years, she didn't really process it. Because Quintin had struggled with addiction, right? And so Quintin and his addiction had been a source of chaos in our life and trauma at times. It's hard. And for parents who've had kids in addiction, it's very hard, road to walk. And so I think for the first 2 years, she didn't really process it. And then it really hit her 2 years afterwards. I think she got a little bit more emotionally mature. And I think enough time went by for kind of the numbness shock and then the anger that she was carrying around his addiction. It took 2 years for it to kind of hit. And then she grieved really heavily, and she wasn't trying to hear from her mom. She was a teenage girl who was not trying to hear what mom had to say about it. And she even has kind of a love-hate relationship with the work that I do. Sometimes I think she would want to just distance herself from it, and she doesn't want the public or people knowing our story or, it's very private business of hers, and then other times she's really proud and glad that I'm doing so. All things with teenage girls, it's a bit of a moving target. I think that she's in a good place with it. She's at the point now where she just really misses her big brother, and she misses him at all those monuments. And, she's a senior in high school this year, so she'll be graduating, and I know it'll be and yeah, she doesn't have any other siblings or anything. So I know it's hard for her.
Yeah, it is often hard for siblings, and that's why I actually ended up writing that book is because I couldn't find a lot on sibling loss because I think that, and I don't know if this was the experience with your daughter and now some time has passed and if she shared this or not, but I think, and you've done so much work and now you are the grief guru who's out there helping it's not just other parents, right? You help all people going
Right.
through all different kinds of grief. But that one of the things that I think a lot of siblings share is kind of swallowing back our grief in those early stages because we want to support our grieving parents because it's very difficult for a child to watch, no matter how old we are, to watch our parents grieving that loss. And then I think sometimes there's almost a delayed response from a sibling because they're so worried. Like your daughter was, you said it
Yeah.
I can't remember if you said it prior to us recording of what your daughter said right
Yeah.
after. Tell us.
Yeah. That was her first words when it was confirmed that he had passed. Her first words to me were, "You're not going anywhere, are you, Mom?" She was really concerned because of the way my mom passed away, that I would not be able to navigate this. And I'm so encouraged that we're having this conversation because this is what I tell parents. Like, you don't have the luxury of this isn't optional for you. I say all the time, trauma is not your fault, but healing is your responsibility. And if you're a parent that has lost a child and the pain is unimaginable, but you have other kids that they can't lose a sibling and a parent, and so if you become emotionally unavailable, that's going to be detrimental for them. And so I always just plead with parents, do the hard work. And not that you have to minimize or hide your pain, because kids need to see you hurting, but they also need to see you tackling it and working on it and making a safe place for everybody to show up exactly how they are, not pretending like things are okay or not this or that. Be real with it, but also not facing it either. And it's a tough thing as a parent, but it's what we're called to do. And I just want to help other parents do that.
And I will say this, the Bereaved Parents Conference, I don't know if you ever gone to that. I was a keynote speaker a couple of years ago and, speaking obviously from the perspective of a sibling. And then also in preparation for the book I was writing, I read books around parents who had lost children. And one of the themes that became very clear to me, parents have couple of different responses. One, they can become overprotective of their surviving children, right? For obvious reasons, because they're terrified of losing another. Right. And I felt that way initially, so scared of losing another sibling. Or parents can become more detached because of that trauma.
As like a self-preservation mechanism. Yeah.
It's a self-preservation. And then of course, there's a third choice. That is what you are talking about, where okay, you've got to be able to process your trauma and do your work around it because you do have surviving children that need you desperately, especially when you've got young children at home. Yeah. Forget about your adult children, right? I mean, they're going to survive, but when you've got these children at home, they need their parent. They're scared to death that they're going to lose. There's going to be another death, just like your daughter said, please don't leave me. We see this too when I did work at the Center for Grieving Children, especially when they've lost one parent. When are they going to lose another? Because their innocence has been shattered, that they're going to grow up with their siblings and their parents, and we're all going to live this happy life. And my parents are going to die first when they're old. That's gone. So these young kids have to grow up very, very fast when they have this realization that death is actually very real. You don't have to be 95 before you.
Right. None of us are guaranteed. Yeah.
None of us are guaranteed anything beyond this moment in time that you and I are having right now. So what did your daughter do? Did she go to a grief group? Did she see a counselor? Did she talk openly with you? How did you support your daughter in her own grief journey?
Yeah, all of the above. She was actually seeing a counselor even before this happened. We had just moved to Florida and we had life changes happening. So she was already getting support. So she's consistently seeing a counselor this entire time. But it's interesting that Quintin's passing isn't always the topic. She just has life, and kids. What I've heard from other experts is that kids are much more compartmentalized than adults are. They can pick it up and set it down and just, flip a switch and not be thinking of it, but then it'll show up again a few months later or whatever. So I just tried to give her freedom and room I just wanted to let her know that I was a safe place when it was bothering her and that she could come and talk to me and we would get her support. But I tried to be sensitive to not, and that was one thing we had to work our way through. There was a season where she was just she felt like I was talking about Quintin all the time. And as a parent who's recovering from grief and loss, I certainly didn't feel that way, but I had to be sensitive to how she was perceiving it, whether that was my perceived reality or not. She did go to a support group, a peer support group, but same thing. She went a couple times and didn't find it helpful beyond that. And she is a journaler and a writer. She writes poetry. And she's the type that she has a group of close friends and she leans on them a lot and trusts them a lot, and they're good relationships for her. And she doesn't for her, it's very private and personal. She doesn't like going out much beyond that. And so those have been kind of her tools.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, because I do think it really is navigating loss as a family, because the grief journey can feel very isolating and very lonely. And I think that when you get inside your family bubble and it's a family member inside that family bubble that died, it leaves a massive hole, and I think sometimes kids wish their parents, because some parents don't talk about their child that they lost, right? Because they don't want to cause their children harm. And children don't talk about it because they don't want to cause their parent harm. And so they get into this cycle that isn't helpful for the family. But I think if you can start to open that conversation around, if you're talking with your daughter and she's like, Mom, I feel like you're talking about Quintin all the time, that it's just an open dialogue of understanding what people need, because nobody knows what anybody needs unless we can have a conversation about it. And of course, group work is not for everyone. And sometimes therapy is not for everyone.
Right.
So what are those outlets that can be beneficial so that each person within that family is feeling heard and seen, and also being able to have their grief journey? I mean,
yeah. And I'm such an advocate, and part of what I help coach people to do is to find support outside of their family. It's exactly like if you've experienced a sibling loss, and if your parent is your main source of support typically in life, but they're dealing with their own grief, so they're probably not in a place that they can be the support that you need. And so I help people navigate that. That was part of what was disconcerting, is that my typical support group couldn't be a support to me in this, because they were all grieving as well. My sister was a typical good support for me, but she lost her mom and then she lost her nephew. And so I had to discover I need to find support just for me, because the people that are my typically support have all been traumatized as well, and they have their own journey and they're processing it their way, which sometimes isn't the same, right? And so, I would just recommend for children and parents alike to make sure that they have support outside of each other. They can be a support to one another, but you really need to have a safe place with somebody who isn't grieving the same loss and going through the same trauma, that can be a neutral support just for you.
100%. I think that is a beautiful point. As a matter of fact, in the grief and loss groups that we ran, siblings were not put in the same group for that exact reason. They needed to be able to have their own experiences because they have their own journey. Something else that you said that I want to hit on is it is not linear the way kids grieve, and they can put it down and they can compartmentalize. And also sometimes they'll have behaviors that are a grief response, even though we may not recognize that behavior as a grief response. All of that is really important. That can look very different for different kids. So I want to say that it may seem like they're lashing out of nowhere, and it's always remembering that they're going through grief. If I can't count the number of times I've had to remind parents of that, whether that child has lost a parent, a sibling, a grandparent, if it was a really close relationship, anything like that, that even if it's a year later, I think in our mind, the world moves on after 2 weeks after a loss, not because they don't love you, but because life moves on. It just does.
Yeah.
And there is this pattern where I've seen, and this was true for me, that at that 4-month mark, people can really hit a wall because the busyness is over. The shock has worn off, and it can get worse before it gets better. So
Yeah.
I want to go back to the things that you have learned. How long did it take you after your mother's death when you really started practicing these daily, what do you want to call them, activities, thoughts? I'm not sure what language you put to it, but how long did it take you when you were actively practicing before you started to feel better?
Significantly better. Yeah. I would say 2 to 3 months, really. So it was about 9 months after her passing where I saw that speaker speak and thought, oh, something can be done. And then I just started paying radical attention to everything in my surroundings. I started paying attention to how I felt before and after things and started making adjustments. And I started, reading and studying. I would say 2 to 3 months. And that's really what we see when we're working with people. We do a 12-week program. And if you put your mind to it and really focus and work on these skills consistently, you're going to see a dramatic difference within 12 weeks time.
Do you have a recommendation of when they would start that 12-week program? I mean, to give themselves some time after that loss?
Yeah, absolutely. And everybody's different, but I agree with your timelines. I always say 3 weeks, like 3 weeks is when everyone else goes back to their life and you're like, wait a minute, what? Like that. And then 3 to 6 months, in my experience, is when the shock wears off and when people even are cognitively ready to try to start to implement recovery, because you have brain fog is a real thing, and grief brain, and you're not sleeping, you're not eating. You have to get to a place of being somewhat stable before you can start trying to learn recovery. But I will say, when Quintin died, I started doing the work right away. So there are the exceptions where they may be ready before that. But generally speaking, really for me, 6 months is the magic. If someone's 6 months out, they're ready. I would go as early as 3 months out if someone's really eager, but kind of that 6 month mark seems to be a really great spot for being ready for the work of recovery.
Yeah, that's basically, yes, I think that's a great timeline. Do you think though that you were more ready? I mean, given the work that you're doing, I don't know when you started doing this work. Was this after Quintin's death or after your mother's death? When did you start being able to actually offer people support services?
Well, I started, after Quintin's passing. So in the journey with my mom, it was 100% just self-discovery and for my own self. And then when Quintin passed and I applied and saw how fast, like how quickly I was navigating it, that's when I really felt compelled to share it with others. And honestly, even days after his passing, I asked in prayer, I asked God for 300,000. I asked for 300,000 lives to be impacted for good because of this one life that was lost. And that's kind of my mission that I'm on, is to spread this message and in some way positively impact 300,000 people in his honor and for his legacy. So I've been, so fairly soon. I mean, he passed away in July, and in August we were, putting things on paper and starting, groups and Facebook. And, I wrote the book a few months after that. So it's been, kind of straight after he passed away, just hitting the ground running and putting all this stuff to work.
Had you been thinking about helping others with what you had done with your mom? And so it was just sort of the timing, or was it really when Quintin died and this was your son and you're like, God, I mean, because this is the biggie, right? Losing a child is the biggie that can really destroy people's lives.
Yeah, no, I wasn't doing grief work and it wasn't on my radar at all. It really was, I lost my son and I knew instantly I wanted his life to mean something and to make a difference. And initially I thought, and I do a lot of work around the opioid epidemic and overdose awareness. Like initially I thought it would be more focused on that. It wasn't until I noticed that my grief recovery journey was so night and day different from when I lost my mom. And to your point, losing my mom was traumatic and whatever, but losing a child is so unnatural, right? And they were both very sudden traumatic things. And so the fact that I was recovering and moving through it so much faster, that's when I really felt honestly like an obligation that people need to know this. People need to learn this. People need to know that they don't have to stay stuck and sad forever. There are things that they can do that can help. And they're probably doing things unknowingly that is keeping them stuck. And I just really honestly have a bit of a sense of responsibility to share that with people.
Well, I can feel your passion. I can hear it. I can see it in your face. And I'm so excited that I've had you on. I'm so excited that I'm having you as a guest because I know that I've got listeners going, oh my God, how do I sign up for the 12?
Oh, good.
And so why don't we go there? The last question I always ask people before we get into how they can find you.
Yeah.
And I just hear it. But how do you practice self-love now?
How do I practice self-love? Well, for me, like with everything else, it comes down to daily habits. So probably the biggest thing that has changed my life and that I'll do for the rest of my life is I always start my day the same way. Of the first 2 hours of my day are for me. And I spend time in prayer and meditation and reading and working out and just that's like oxygen to me. If I don't start my day that way, it's bad for everybody. But that is, I find when I start my day that way and I start the beginning part of my day doing what's best for me and what I need for me, that's what makes me able to show up for others and to do what I'm called to do in the earth. And so that is the biggest gift and the biggest foundational thing that I do every day and will continue to do.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to say to listeners that I haven't asked you?
If I can say anything, if you're struggling with grief and if you're feeling like healing and recovery isn't possible or that you're going to be sad forever, please, please, please hear that it is possible. One thing I always say is that healing isn't instant and it isn't easy, but it is possible and it is worth it. So please get a fire in your belly. Research. If you're listening to this podcast, it means you're looking for tools and help and support. So go find the tools, help and support that's right for you and do the work until you're recovered, because it is possible. And the rest of us, not just your kids and family, all of us need you to be recovered so that you can be the fullest expression of yourself in the world and do what you're called to do.
That is so beautifully put. You also wrote a book. Can you give us the title of your book?
Yeah, the book is You're Not Crazy, You're Grieving, because grieving can feel like, I know for me, I thought I was going crazy. One of the things, like, nobody talks about the physicality of grief, the heaviness in your chest and feeling like someone's stabbing you or punching you in the stomach, like all this stuff, it feels like you're losing your mind. And so, yeah, that's the title of the book. You're Not Crazy, You're Grieving.
All right. And we'll have that title too. You can find Kelli at thegriefguru.com, right?
It's The Grief Guru everywhere. So on Instagram, Facebook, all those, YouTube, The Grief Guru, and the website is thegriefguru.com. And I think I gave you a link. We offer an audio version of the book we offer for folks free of charge. So, and it's actually me reading the book. So if you want to listen to me share my story, it's about 4 hours start to finish. So it's a fairly quick read, but people can go to imnotcrazyimgrieving.com and get that audio book.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait. I will download that tonight. I want to just thank you so much. This is such a breath of fresh air to have you come on and talk about the tools and the inspiration for being able to really help catapult that healing journey when people are in this deep, deep grief. And I want to thank you so much for that. But truly, Kelli, I want to thank you for the incredible work that you're doing out in the world.
It's my pleasure and my mission and my assignment for the rest of my days here. And I appreciate all you're doing too. I'm always a fan of anyone that's working in this space to help encourage and support those that are tackling grief. Because for, I think all of us, it's the hardest thing that we ever face in our life. And so we need more examples of victory, healing, and hope, and more people who are willing to hold somebody's hand and show them the way. And so I'm a fan as well. Appreciate all that you do.
Thank you. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in this week. And we'll see you here all next week. Bye for now.